Okay. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? Get yourself a slate.
Sure. So my name is Dr. Brendan O'Connor. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Transborder Studies here at ASU. I'm also affiliate faculty in the Teachers College. So I'm an anthropologist of education, which means that in general I do research on social and cultural and also linguistic issues, kind of broadly related to education. And specifically I focus on mostly on Mexican American students in the US Southwest. So my whole identity and career as a scholar really came out of my trajectory as a teacher. So the first teaching I ever did was when I was in college, and that was in an adult ESL program with Spanish-speaking, newly arrived recent immigrants to the U.S. And then after college, I taught third grade in South Texas in a rural bilingual community in South Texas. And I just, all the teaching that I did from that point on really was with a focus on Latino students. My high school-based research in Arizona was during 2010, 2011, right? So this is the era of SB 1070, this is the era of HB 2281, the Ethnic Studies Bill. A lot of sort of overtly anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican, anti-Spanish legislation in Arizona. So some of the questions I had about the students in this school were just, how are they dealing with this, right? How are students in this primarily Mexican-American school, some of whom, not all of whom of course, but some of whom were undocumented, many of whom had family on both sides of the border. How are they kind of like processing this stuff on a daily basis? What difference did it make for how, what difference did it make for the way peer culture looked at the school, but also what difference did it make for just for the way they experienced school, I guess. Students of Mexican origin were kind of being singled out as problematic, in a lot of this legislation. That sense of place really shaped how students related to each other and how students made sense of the world around them there. And then in the research in Texas, place played a different role. I mean, the reality of the border for the students in South Texas was a physical, a physical geopolitical reality. It wasn't a metaphorical borderlands. It wasn't even a sort of extended borderlands in the way that you can think of Tucson or Phoenix as part of the borderlands. I mean, the geopolitical border was in the backyard of the university. I would park my car in a parking lot, and behind the parking lot was the border levee, and you could see the Border Patrol trucks driving back and forth. I got interested in students' sense of place in Brownsville, Matamoros, which is where I did this research, and students' mobility, right? So the way that the border affected students' mobility on an everyday basis for students who lived in Mexico and came to the U.S. to take classes, or for students who lived in the U.S. but had to go to Mexico to see family, maybe every weekend, right? And what I found in that study, too, was that the specific sense of place of being right there on the border in this community and having to sort of deal with the border on a regular basis really profoundly shaped how students saw themselves as students, sort of how they saw their academic identity, and then also, I guess what you would call their broader social identity. The kind of big thing that came out of that study for me, and the finding that I like the best, was that students felt that spending time on both sides of the border and having to negotiate the border on a regular basis actually gave them a better informed, sort of more expansive perspective on reality. Well, so one thing that was interesting about the research in Southern Arizona, I mean, you said that sometimes you said you don't come across necessarily as a stereotypical Mexican to people, even though you are Mexican, right? Or that somebody called you the whitest Mexican they'd ever seen. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's okay for me to say that, but one thing that was really interesting about the work in Arizona was that students at the high school were very concerned with making these distinctions about who was more Mexican versus who was less Mexican, based not on skin color, not on sort of, racial phenotype or physical appearance, but more on, what language you preferred to speak, who you spent your time with, what kind of music you liked, if you had strong connections to relatives in Mexico. I mean, all these other kind of social things. And I came to see this as a reflection in some ways of all of this discourse that was going on in Arizona and in the US around that time about trying to differentiate Mexican people or brown people from other kinds of people in the US.